Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted to be here in Hanoi, one of my favorite cities, and in Asia, as I am too at this responsible business forum for food and agriculture. And let me just mention briefly that The Economist recently held a World Ocean Summit in Portugal, at which one of the key areas that we focused on was this question of overfishing. And some of the solutions that we need to bring to overfishing, including particularly how we deal with small-scale fisheries, and indeed how we create solutions around aggregation of small-scale fisheries, around financing, and particularly around some of the policy-related issues that small-scale fisheries require, and that is reform of policy in country, plus also particularly governance-related reform in countries where overfishing is a serious problem. And I think there are a lot of parallels between that discussion and the discussion that we're about to have. As you know, and I'm not going to go over this in great detail, ASEAN today faces a very significant set of problems in relation to smallholding agriculture, poverty, disenfranchisement of many smallholders across the region, and I think set against the context of priorities, economic priorities that have been set by many ASEAN countries around manufacturing investment, the growth of consumption-led economies. Agriculture, as Simon and the earlier panel were saying, does seem to be quite often an afterthought. And particularly when we relate that to the bigger question of ASEAN economic integration, agriculture often seems to be an afterthought. And that's not surprising. Agriculture is always politically a hugely sensitive area to tackle, even in other regional situations, like, for example, the European Union. Agriculture has always remained an extraordinarily complex area to resolve politically. So not surprising, but certainly it seems to me in this process of ASEAN integration that a greater level of focus around agriculture is now necessary if we're going to resolve some of these problems. But that, I hope, is going to be part and parcel of this panel discussion, and I do encourage you to ask questions. If I can understand this technology, I will try and work it. If not, then just raise your hand and we'll start bringing questions in from the floor. Let me just introduce my very distinguished panelists. Next to me, Marianne Smallwood, who is the Regional Partnerships Builder for US Agency for International Development, USAID. Thank you for joining us, Marianne. Next to Marianne is Prakash Janwar. Prakash is the Regional Controller, Southeast Asia for Olam International. And then, last but not least, Maria Dolores Bernabe, better known as Riza Bernabe, who is the East Asia Grow Research and Policy Coordinator for Oxfam. So as per the format, I'm going to allow each of them to give 3 or 4 minutes of introductory remarks, setting out some of their thoughts, and then we're going to go into a discussion. So, Marianne.
Great, thanks, Charles. And thank you to Global Initiatives for having me speak today, and welcome and good morning to everyone. So as you mentioned, I work for USAID, the US Agency for International Development. And can I just see a show of hands of people who are familiar with USAID or know? Fantastic, thanks. So for those of you who have not raised your hands and are already wondering why I'm using so many acronyms, USAID is the Agency for International Development for the US government. So we work part and parcel with the State Department. And we're present among over 100 countries in the world, and I'm based in our regional office in Bangkok, but we do have operations in an office here in Vietnam, as well as throughout South and Southeast Asia. And rather than give you a long introduction on what USAID is, and it's a development agency, I will rather talk about how we've transitioned into how we do development. So USAID has been around for decades, and in the past 20 years, a lot of our work has gone from giving foreign assistance through public money, and that amount of money has actually decreased. And so if you could imagine a pie chart, the amount of money that the US government has been putting into developing countries has gone down. The amount of money that companies like Olam have provided to developing countries through investments has gone up. And so the way that USAID has, over the past 10 years, evolved how it provides money is through private sector engagement. And myself, as the regional partnerships builder, that's what I focus on. But our work, in terms of working with the private sector, working with donors, et cetera, it's very much centered around the knowledge that for things to be sustainable, and we'll keep using that word, but for things to be sustainable, we have to make sure that these companies that are investing these dollars into developing countries are doing it in a way that makes sense for communities, that makes sense for poorer communities, that makes sense for vulnerable population, et cetera. And that, in this case, is relevant to agriculture, obviously. And so what we have done recently is really integrate what we call STIP, which is Science, Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. But now, in our future programs, in all of our upcoming project designs, what we, as technical advisors, and what we try to do is integrate all 4 of those elements into upcoming work, because we've realized that the way we've done development, the way that the development sector has worked and tried to improve conditions, working conditions, and poverty in these countries, there's always room for improvement, and we could do better. We could spend the money better, we could spend the money more efficiently, we can use technologies such as mobile technologies, tools like impact investment, et cetera. We can do that better. And so what I work on and what thousands across the agency work on is how can we do this more efficiently? If it's working with smallholder farmers, how can we work smartly with Olam? How can we work with other donors? Like DFID, for example, or how can we work with other partners like Oxfam to make sure that where we're putting our money isn't duplicated, where we're trying to help isn't the same areas as other NGOs are trying to help or other donors are trying to work in. And that part and that mentality is just trying to parallel and leverage and complement what everyone is doing, as opposed to being repetitive in terms of our work. So I think that was about 2 or 3 minutes, and I don't want to go on too much, but we'll get more into some of the approaches in terms of finance, in terms of tools and technologies that USAID has been doing in recent years. Thanks.
So Marianne, just briefly,
Sure.
You mentioned obviously the changing nature of the way in which donors, NGOs, and the private sector work together.
Right.
One reason you gave was this sense that donor dollars were decreasing and private sector had money in its back pocket to put into things. There surely must be, I sense a much more sort of structural set of changes going on, and the private sector now is part of both the sustainability, conservation, and growth equation, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, and the way that, again, USAID has been doing partnerships for years, but, for example, Syngenta is here, Olam is here, Unilever is here. These are 3 very large multinationals, very well-respected multinationals that we've worked with. And the way that USAID approaches it is as donor dollars are decreasing, and, we've worked for decades in trying to support these countries. So as donor dollars are decreasing, and as the private sector, as businesses gain prominence, expand their operations, employ local Vietnamese, local Burmese, local Cambodians, what we see as our responsibility is to work with those companies as they build their operations to make sure that the poorest of the poor are still being supported and developed as they work for employers like these companies. And it's important for us to be able to help work alongside with and help shape those programs if necessary or if helpful or if needed. So that's our kind of our mentality or driving force, is that there's a famous quote, but it takes a village, right? And so it takes more than just the private sector. It takes more than just the government, either US government or national, and it takes more than just the NGOs. And it's working in concert and complementing one another in the ways that we each have our own strengths, our own weaknesses, and where we can see others like Olam and Oxfam fitting in.
Thanks, Marianne. Let's move on, shall we? Let's take those thoughts. In a sense, the idea that the market forces alone are not going to transform agriculture and push it back to the end to Riza. And Riza, we've had the donor perspective, let's have the NGO perspective.
Thank you very much, Charles. Is my voice okay? Can you hear it?
Yeah, you might need to speak up a little bit.
Yeah.
Can everybody hear Riza? Just say so.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
great.
So before I respond to the questions posed by Charles, let me first provide a very brief overview of the GROW campaign. The GROW campaign, Oxfam's GROW campaign, is the campaign on food security. It's distinct from the campaign, GROW Asia campaign, which is under the WEF, or the World Economic Forum. The goal of the GROW campaign is essentially to create a planet where everyone has enough to eat, and a cornerstone of that goal, achieving that goal, is really establishing sustainable food production system, key strategies that we see that are essential to promoting sustainable rural livelihoods.
Thanks, Riza, very much. I want to come back to a number of those in the discussion, particularly climate change, particularly how you engage business in more responsible sort of investments. But let's come straight to business on that note and ask you how you're working responsibly in this area. Prakash.
Yeah, first of all, can you hear me all? Yeah, hi, good morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. First of all, a brief 2 words about Forland. This is the 25th year anniversary of Forland. So we started in 1989, and we have grown to become one of the leading global players in agricultural products such as cocoa, coffee, cotton, edible nuts, etc. At this point of time, I would also like to congratulate Vietnam particularly. In the last 20 years, Vietnam has emerged as an agri-giant, especially for the products that we deal in. So for products such as coffee, for rice, for cashews, Vietnam has almost become from zero to one of the largest players in the world. It's the second largest exporter of coffee in the world, the largest exporter of cashews, the largest exporter of pepper, the third largest exporter of natural rubber. So we are talking significant volumes in Vietnam. Being such a small nation, this is an outstanding achievement. I think a round of applause for Vietnam's agri sector. So what I wanted to focus now is really on the key trends that are underpinning ASEAN in particular. And as per us, the first key trend is ASEAN is a scale producer and a low cost producer of key agricultural commodities. And what I mean by that is, let's say for products such as coffee, for products such as rice, for products such as palm oil, ASEAN is the lowest cost producer in the world. And not only it's the lowest cost producer, it is also the largest, one of the largest producers in the world. So between Thailand and Vietnam, ASEAN pretty much controls the overall rice exports of the world. And that's a staggering statement. But is ASEAN taking full advantage of that position, economic position? Probably not. The second key trend is that we are seeing robust internal demand within ASEAN. What I mean by that is whether it's for meat products, for dairy products, for wheat products, etc. ASEAN is a large consumer of food where it imports wheat, dairy, etc. from other countries and consumes. And because of the growing middle class, these sectors are growing at between 7 to 8% per annum CAGR. The third key trend that we see is that there is increased offshoring of food ingredients into these regions. What I mean by that is that a lot of food ingredients such as instant coffee, roasted cashew nuts or palm products are being outsourced to the region, which were hitherto produced in the developed countries. As more and more factories which have come up, which are food safe, which have HACCP certifications, etc., food sector has grown a lot in ASEAN. The fourth key thing that we see is that a lot of consumer link-ups are happening wherein the FMCG companies or the food companies are now directly reaching with food link-ups where they are, let's say in some cases, saying that this is the produce from a particular region is ASEAN and they're providing it directly to the consumer. So a lot of such regional cooperative level link-ups are happening, which is very, very heartening, which is very progressive from a farmer's perspective. And fifth, which is the key one as well, is the government in many cases in ASEAN is on a tightrope, because on one side there is an inflation, which is a food inflation, and on one side there is a farmer income. And obviously these are at opposite sides of the spectrum. So most of the governments are on a tightrope, wherein they have to manage the food inflation as well as optimizing farmer income, especially when it concerns to products such as rice. So this, let's say on a broad spectrum, these are the key trends. And there are 2 or 3 mega trends which are running across the across the ASEAN economy. The first one, which I believe is the most critical, which is the volatility. Really, what is hurting the smallholder the most in our ASEAN economy or world economy in general is really the food volatility or the price volatility in agricultural commodities. Well, there is no easy way out of it because we live in a VUCA world, which is volatile, uncertain, uncertain and ambiguous. We have weather uncertainties, we have yield uncertainties. Right now, as we speak, we are probably in the midst of an El Nino year. So food prices keep on going up or down, which kind of hurts the farmer incomes the most. I think that is really something which is hurting. The second key megatrend that I see is the urbanization, and across ASEAN I see this trend of urbanization where no one really wants to live in rural areas. And what begs us to the question is, how do we incentivize and motivate the next generation of ASEAN to live in rural areas and actually do farming? This is the biggest challenge that we face as a company, is that we do not see many of the youngsters really excited about farming and prospects related to farming right now. So these are the mega trends that we see in the region. Couple of things that I wanted to say about rural incomes and livelihoods. We believe that there are 4 or 5 areas on which rural livelihood can be impacted. The first is improved productivity. I think Vietnam has shown, especially in coffee, on how improved productivity can lead to increased rural incomes. If we could just transplant this productivity from Vietnam to Indonesian Robusta farmer in South Sumatra, we can transform rural incomes in Indonesia. So I see a lot of possibilities of engagement within ASEAN itself, wherein the best practices of agriculture, if they can be transported and transplanted from one region to another, we can have increased farmer incomes. The second big thing that I think is improved quality. What I mean by that is harvesting practices, the selection of the varietals, etc., which can lead to better quality of the product and better price realization because of that. And in that respect, just if we can provide a genetic, if we can say this is 100% fragrant rice out of Vietnam, we can improve the farm in Mekong Delta quite significantly. And the third is improved infrastructure, in which what we mean is better processing facilities, better transportation facilities, etc. Mekong Delta continues to be a very low cost producer of rice because it uses river transport, low cost transport, which it is able to, because of that it is able to pass on those cost advantages to the consumer.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are the top 2-3 things that I think that we can do. I personally think that I agree with both Riza and Marianne that no one can do it alone. We all have to collaborate and act together to do it. But I think if you ask me, we are in a very good industry. We are in the right environment right now. And most importantly, ASEAN has the right agronomy to make it work. So I am very optimistic. I have a bullish bias that agronomy in ASEAN will work very well. Thank you.
Thanks, Prakash, very much. So, I want to take up 1 or 2 of the points that you've just raised and then just throw them into this discussion. The sense that smallholders, why source from smallholders? Very difficult set of issues and challenges. You've raised some of those challenges. Quality, lack of certification, the difficulty of aggregating them and so on and so forth. And some economists might argue, well, why don't we just get lots of smallholders into cities and put them into jobs in urban areas and so on and so forth. So let's start, perhaps Riza, with you. Let's talk about the developmental set of issues that sit around this. Why do we need to think in the way that we're thinking today about smallholders?
I think it's essential to think about smallholders because, as stated in the conference document, and as we all know, when we talk about ASEAN, a large segment of the population are still engaged in agricultural production. In fact, if you look at the poorest segment of society across the region, a lot of them are in the agricultural sector. So that means interventions in smallholder agriculture, promoting productivity in the agricultural sector can really do a lot in terms of addressing poverty across the region.
So addressing poverty from a donor's perspective, obviously that's key, isn't it?
Right. So USAID focuses, particularly with our agriculture portfolio, we focus on what we call feed the future countries. And so these are the countries that are most vulnerable in the world to food insecurity. I'm thinking right now, so we focus on, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Nepal are some of the select countries that we work on. And in those three countries, the average smallholder farmer has less than 2 hectares of land to farm. And one of USAID's actually driving mission is to help support those who are in extreme poverty and help end extreme poverty. And when you have millions of people with that little land using short-term crops, basically subsistence farmers feeding themselves, and then if they're lucky, trying to sell the extra that they have to earn money and to earn income. That's the populace that we're working with in Southeast Asia. And so, we've all seen the data about the amount of population boom that we'll have, by 2020 and by 2050, and we have the same amount of arable land. So you have growing population. Most of that population is farming on very small plots. Where is this going to come from? Where is the increased amount of agriculture going to come from? It's, we have to use technology. We have to be creative about what we're doing. We have to, increase our productivity, use fertilizer better, help, poor smallholder farmers use seed better, plant different varieties, make the soil last longer than they're currently able to do. And that's all, for USAID, that's critical to do for smallholder farmers. And for people who aren't necessarily getting the technology or the skills or the technical assistance that can help them grow better, both for their families, first of all, and then, if they're connected to supply chains and value chains, then for the rest of us that are eating, 3 meals a day if we're lucky, and for most of the people in the world, less than that.
So we're seeing 2 models of economic development going on here. One is a model where we're looking at trying to encourage smallholders to remain on their plots so that and then create value for those smallholders so that they can then raise their incomes, create businesses, create value. And then a separate developmental model, which is going on in China, for example, where you're seeing a wholesale movement out of farms into cities. And the encouragement of that movement out of farms into cities so that you can aggregate and scale farming in a similar way to as you would in for example, developed economies. So why are we looking at these 2 different models of development, and what's important to understand about why we think smallholders are really important? Yeah. Prakash, I'll throw that to you.
So whatever I've seen in ASEAN, that let's say in Vietnam, 68% of the population right now is a rural population. That's a large percentage. I guess China would have been in a similar situation previously. But tough for me to compare China to ASEAN, but what I see in ASEAN is that here also the land holdings are very small, 2 to 3 hectares per farmer. But the farmer is very productive, especially in Vietnam. And I think, can they become more productive? Definitely yes. I particularly see that you can scale up the farmlands in rural areas itself through cooperative movements, etc., which probably does both, that you aggregate land banks, yet provide that responsibility, accountability to each smallholder, that they have to contribute to increase productivity. And across some areas that we are seeing evidence of that working. So we have had some success in rice in Mekong Delta, where we have corporatized some of these farms, provide them common genetic material so that the quality is consistent, and yet because there is a definite and distinct advantage of the entrepreneurship that smallholders bring in. Once you think as an entrepreneur, you do a lot to those lands, you tend the land better, you take good care of it, and that's one of the reasons why Vietnam has been so successful. So I personally believe probably that cooperative level agriculture yet run by smallholders can be a good way in which Vietnam or ASEAN can progress in the future.
I think that's a good thought. Risa, I wonder if you could take that on. I mean, this problem of aggregation, this, I suppose, challenge of bringing smallholders together so that they create some level of scale and they become investable, they become marketizable entities. What are the challenges that you see there?
There are many challenges to that, but of course, we need to address these challenges. And the first challenge revolves around the fact that infrastructure in the local areas are really very limited to do aggregation. So that's where government needs to come in to provide support services so that farmers can really work together in terms of aggregating. And when we talk about aggregating is not only about marketing but also about processing. So there is really need to provide investment so that you are able to provide farmers with the necessary support services to work together, to market their products together, as well as to process it together. And in that process, get better value from the value chain, get better gains from the value chain. There is a very big danger in terms of just improving productivity and not being able to pull them together and then sell them to the market. No. Just a few weeks ago, I went to a community in the Philippines and they were producing a lot of mangoes, but the mangoes are rotting because they cannot sell it. There's nobody, they have a lot of mangoes, but they have to pull it together to sell it to the market.
So this quite important set of linkages that needs to happen between a group of disaggregated farmers that may come together to produce in slightly greater scale, but then linking them to a more formal market seems to me to be, to the distribution network, seems to be fundamental. Is that part of what you're looking at, Marianne?
Yeah, a lot of the work that USAID has done in the region that's been really successful, and particularly in the agribusiness sector, is when we're able to partner with either other donors or work with the Oxfams and the plans and the Winrocks and all of the people that are actually doing our work, and make sure that we're not being duplicative, right, of where others are working, where others are funding technical assistance, where others are funding projects, because by doing that you're actually just funding the same farmers, you're funding the same communities. And so it's wonderful that they're reaping the benefits of that, but then you're ignoring a lot of the communities that are, say, in northwest Vietnam, far northwest Vietnam, that aren't getting that support. And so that's one tenet. The second is a lot of the successful partnerships that we have had have been with Cargill and Syngenta and various other companies across the value chain, right? Across the value chain, in that they perform different functions or they provide different assets. And for them, that's complementary. And obviously with companies here, it can be a little bit competitive in terms of wanting to keep your intellectual property to oneself and not being competitive or helping necessarily other companies within your industry. But if you can create a partnership that is complementary and that works with members of the value chain in their in their roles, in their areas, then that does actually from farm to table improve a lot of both the productivity, creating that demand, creating that market for more mangoes, creating that market for a different rice variety that maybe hasn't been grown to success yet in Burma, but could be, for example.
Rakesh, I wonder if you'd pick up that point around intellectual property and the way in which technology, ideas, information is transfused to farmers, to smallholders.
Yeah, so we have had a lot of experiences in doing this together with NGOs and donor companies, etc. So I think one of the key things is market linkages and off-take agreement, as we call it. That if we do the improved productivity, there will be more produced, but do we have a market for that? So many a times, I think there are many types of food products, and we get lost in this maze. But I just want to highlight that some food products are like storable, like we have coffee or cocoa or pepper, which can be stored for a couple of years, no problems. But then there are perishables like mangoes that she talked about. And when you do a project around perishables, fruits, vegetables, etc., we have to be very, very nuanced and link it to the market immediately, because otherwise no such project will work. And all the hard work that we do will be actually rotting, as she rightly put out. But what I have seen in the last 5-6 years is really an increased impetus of an integrated campaign in which most of us work together with an offtake agreement. And we link it not only to the companies such as us, which process the material and export it, but actually to the end user companies, which know how to use this material and better still, market it to the end user and the consumer. We've had a couple of projects with USAID in Indonesia, in Sulawesi, where we increased the farmer productivity, but we also linked it with cocoa grinders in US, who would buy those Indonesian cocoa and sell it to Mars or Hershey's in US. So I personally think that what we are seeing in the last 5-6 years is increased integrated programs wherein people know what their exact role is, what they are expected to perform in that program, and that's why some of these programs are becoming more successful. The programs that are not successful are the ones where there is diffused accountability and responsibility. So the more pinpointed accountability is, the more likely the program is successful.
So when you say diffused accountability and responsibility, what exactly do you mean by that? I mean, there's an interesting question here, which I think hints at a little bit of skepticism about the way in which foreign investors, big business comes into smallholding farmers markets. That question is how the buyers and brands how do buyers and brands help to improve the rural livelihoods of farmers in ASEAN? And I think there is a note of skepticism potentially in that. Prakash, quickly, and then I'm going to pass it on to Riza.
Right. So I think let's face one thing, that every large business, be it ours, be it any large food company, is looking for sustainable supply. And we believe that ASEAN is the right place for sustainable supply, because let's say if you are an instant coffee player, Vietnam is the largest producer of Robusta in the world. It is in the interest of any player in instant coffee to have large production of Vietnamese Robusta. Therefore, they need sustainable supply, not now, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So I think most of the interests of large food companies and companies such as us are actually aligned to that of the smallholders. That's why you see a proliferation of programs wherein large companies are putting in their own monies, in companies including ours, which is to increase farmer productivity, the better quality control at all parts of the supply chain, and more engaged supply chain. I would just take back 15 years back, when most of our industry was sitting in London or Paris or in Switzerland, and operating what I could call quote unquote trading operation sitting out of these countries. Now most companies in our sector have an engaged supply chain where we have physical presence in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in all ASEAN countries, where we have deep engagement with the supply chain, deep engagement with the aggregators and the farmers, where we are doing a lot of activities. So no longer are those days valid where we could just sit in Singapore or London and do these activities. We are a part of this community and we are doing a lot to help them. Now obviously there will be a lot of skepticism wherein people believe that are the FDIs only here for money. Obviously we are for money, and we believe that what really works is reciprocal benefits. What we believe is that if we increase the farmer productivity, there will be larger volumes, and if there will be larger throughput for us, that will lead to increased overhead productivity for us, and therefore larger profits. And similarly for the farmer, increased productivity will mean farmer income. So we actually see that there is reciprocal benefit for both private sector as well as the smallholders in this regard.
So Riza,
yeah,
are the interests aligned?
Yeah, I think I understand where the question is coming from and what's the background behind that. We all know that as ASEAN embarks on the journey of one of its cornerstone policies is really drawing in investments into the sector, and investments from big companies, with the hope that it will jumpstart agricultural productivity as well as agricultural economic activities in the rural areas. And if you look at ASEAN policies, most of its policies are really geared towards attracting investments into the region. We all know that when we talk about private sector, there are a lot of benefits in engaging private sector. They're able to bring in capital, they're able to generate employment, they're able to bring in support services to some. But we also know that across Southeast Asia, there's been a lot of cases of unregulated private sector investments that has also lead to displacement of small farmers, violation of land rights, human rights, and extractive use of the land and water resources. So as ASEAN, I think the challenge really is how to develop regional regulations that will ensure that challenges like these are avoided. No? So when we embark on the 2015 and forward, we should not just only focus about investment liberalization, but we should also focus about safeguarding the rights and interests of the poor communities. No?
And have, as you see it at the moment, has ASEAN, the ASEAN Economic Community, begun to address these particular issues, or is it some way behind?
There are some initiatives. For instance, there are some initiatives around establishing standards along specific commodity chains. So they have standards along good aquaculture practices, but mostly these standards are driven by the desire to, pass standards from the market standards. But if ASEAN is really keen on helping and promoting the rights of communities, it should go beyond the standards and really pushing for regional policies and regulations that safeguards land rights, respects rules around respecting the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, promoting policies around food security. So.
Let me just come to a question that's been asked here. We've talked a lot about the sustainability of creating sustainable livelihoods, creating an economic value chain that's reasonably sustainable. I think this question alludes to that other area of sustainability. It says, great to acknowledge and applaud what Vietnam has done in terms of quantity of production and export. What can you say about the costs for that, especially in terms of sustainability? And I think this is a question about environmental costs as much as it is about other areas of sustainability. I mean, it's a big question, isn't it? I mean, we really need to look at that in far greater detail, it seems to me. Marianne, your thoughts?
I mean, that's if we're going to be forward thinking, right? You can't farm and you can't till soil for 5 or 10 years, then kill the nutrients in the soil, and then leave that and just move to the next land. And if whether it's in agriculture or whether it's the environment, because people are cutting down trees, right? There's teak wood, there's massive deforestation issues throughout Southeast Asia. There's been a lot of attention in Indonesia. I mean, that's all. If we're forward thinking and if we're mindful of the fact that, again, growing population needs more things, but we're killing the amount of land that we will have less of an ability to grow our crops and source our wood and source what we do from the terrain and from the earth. I mean, I would hope, and I think we do have good people at the helms of industry and government and NGOs, but I think that's what USAID really kind of pushes when we partner with companies like Olam, when we partner with organizations like Oxfam. It's are we partnering with, or are we working with those who are mindful of the environmental sustainability, who are mindful of the longevity of the country's populations and of the people who are actually benefiting from or tilling the land, or are we just really kind of pillaging for short-term gains? And from USAID's perspective, if we see, and there are companies, we all know companies that are pillaging for short-term gain, we don't want to obviously we don't want to sanction that, and we would move away from officially partnering with them. But I think it's also the roles of organizations like Oxfam, organizations like USAID, and then responsible companies like Olam to kind of be that thought leader and to work on policies and to work alongside with and exert influence or participate in these larger policy dialogues to improve land tenure issues, to improve the rate at which a certain community forest can be deforested or utilized for its resources. It's a matter of, and that's why the concept of innovatively working together and not having industries work separately because they're concerned about their IPR, not having NGOs work separately because they're concerned about the competitive amount of money that they get from donors like USAID. It's critical that we're all mindful of the long-term, social goals, the long-term environmental goals, and that has to be done part and parcel with local governments. Otherwise, I mean, there is no sustainability, and it's a sad future if that's what we drive towards.
Well,
just probably that's also the reason why one of the recommendations that we have forwarded in ASEAN is to develop some regional rules and regulations about conducting full impact assessment, so that when you look at projects, you evaluate them not only on the basis of what they are doing now, but also look at the sustainability of land resources. Because it's an important role that government has to undertake, because if nobody does that, you know, it will, as you said, will be a very sad future if we just use productive resources now and not care about what will happen in the future.
Well, I think we've had a compelling set of arguments here for collaboration particularly amongst these three sectors here. I wonder, I mean, I've got some questions here that have been posed from you on my little iPad here, but I just thought it might be interesting to throw this out to the audience for comments and questions. So down here, please. If you could just say your name and your organization, please.
Oh yeah, there it is, thank you. My name is Jose Ingles from the Philippines. I wear two hats in this meeting, as a WWF and as a private sector. You know, I was keenly listening to the discussion, and the common thread that I have not heard would be science. I think we should really look how science could actually turn the table on addressing, you know, poverty in the rural areas. If you go to a farm anywhere in Southeast Asia using traditional method, tilling the same soil for generations, farmers and even fishermen does not have any information that their land has been eroded, the nutrients are all gone, and they are using the varieties of seeds that their forefathers and their fathers before that have used. And what is critical is that when you look at the success stories of all our panelists here, they have introduced science, actually. So they have introduced new technology, they have introduced new seeds and way of farming. And I believe this is critical when we talk about, you know, sustaining livelihoods, because science is key to everything. Thank you.
Okay, that's I think a good point. Science, but not science is not all science, of course, is it? It's really about politics and policy too, but science is important. Yes, there we go. Down, we've got two questions on that table first.
Yes, it is working. I'll introduce myself. My name is Norman Kelly. I represent a company called, an organisation called the International Tea Committee, but I'm not really talking from the International Tea Committee. I am a small farmer by birth, and I've worked with small farmers in the tea sector, in which I've been involved with for many years. And I echo the scepticism of your earlier question. There is a lot of talk about being sustainable, but if you get down to my level, it's not very economically sustainable. I can increase my productivity. I have increased my productivity, but the price goes down.
Right.
And I applaud ASEAN as a producer, as a low cost, i.e. low price producer, but there are other countries in the world, other producers, who believe this is rather a beggar my neighbour policy. So I'm afraid I want to ask the question, how can we ensure that more of the value chain gets down to the primary producer, the smallholder farmer? Because at the moment, in most of the supply chains, the closer you get to the market, the larger are the margins. I know that's an economic fact of life, but I want to ask the question, if we're going to be economically sustainable at the farm level, we need to ensure how more of that value gets down to the farmer. So that if he does all the things that you want him to do, increase his productivity, and get his Rainforest Alliance certificate, ensure that he's using all the right pesticides and he complies with MRL legislation, and he's paying the living wage if he happens to employ people, and all the things that are right and that are in part of sustainability, how is he going to pay for it?
I think it's a great question. It was raised in the first session, I think, by yourself, and I'm going to throw it first of all to Prakash, please.
Okay. So if I understand the question, you're saying that there are 2 points that you raised. The first was that if the productivity increase, then the price realization of the farmer goes down, and then his overall income goes down. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is, how do you ensure that the farmer is adequately paid to cover all his costs, etc. Am I understanding your question correct? All right.
And farm in a sustainable way.
So let's start with the second one. I think, you know, First of all, let's understand one thing, that in most cases, are we covering for the most productive farmers? So if Vietnamese farmer is more productive, let's say, than other farmers, whether in India or wherever, are the Vietnamese farmers compensated well? I think it is by and large true that if you are a cost efficient producer, in most cases a smallholder generates reasonable profit. But that begs the second question, that should we kind of compensate the inefficient producers also equally well? That is a very tough one, because ultimately it's a free market worldwide and the efficient producers will be rewarded more than the inefficient ones. But my guess is over the last 4 or 5 years or the last decade or so, I know tea has been in a particularly depressed price, but the agriculture prices have been probably the highest in the last decade over a long period, and I think farmers, efficient farmers, have by and large been compensated well, be it a pepper farmer in Vietnam, be it a coffee farmer in Vietnam, or be it a cashew farmer in Vietnam. You will have pockets wherein some commodities go through a low cycle, let's say the low cycle right now is for rubber, and wherein you can argue that those farmers are not compensated well. But cycles are a part of life, economic cycles, business cycles, commodity price cycles. I wish we could find a way to kind of address those cycles, but it's possibly very difficult for us to address all of that. So that's on my response on the second one.
Can I just come back to that, because I think you're asking a slightly different question. That is, how do you create pricing that actually allows farmers to practice farming sustainably, because they don't get the prices that you get further up the value chain, of course, do they? That's the question that's been asked.
So my personal sense on this is the consumers have to drive it. I think more education, the consumers drive it, and I've seen it in industries such as cocoa. Chocolate is a great industry where the consumer is driving sustainable agricultural practices. Consumer is practicing that no child labor can be used in African farms, and the private sector is commonly opting for that. So we as a company opted for buying cocoa from child labor free farms much earlier, but we had to struggle because of lower margins. But now, because of the consumers, that's a trend that we see ongoing.
Can I just pass the question to Riza? Yeah.
Probably I can respond to the question raised. I think you're right, increasing productivity is just the first step, but it's also very important to help farmers develop enterprises that will allow them to gain greater gains from the value chain. So that means when I was working with the farmers groups when I was younger, way back then, we call it P2C, product to consumers. So you cut the long links so that they're able to gain more profit and gain also more benefit from what they have produced. So that's one. The other strategy is around also corporatized value adding, processing their also able to command higher price for their products. And of course, the other one it's also about providing farmers with access to productive resources such as credit. For instance, across Southeast Asia, one of the challenges to farmers being able to command fair prices for their products is that mostly before they sell their products, they have already borrowed money from the person who is marketing their products. So they sell their products at prearranged price, so they are not able to get good prices for it. So if you provide farmers with good credit, they do not have to be tied up or locked in that type of arrangement.
Marianne, quickly, if you want to just answer
Right,
that
sure.
question. We don't have much time.
No, of course.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note and to echo his point that we have to educate consumers and we have to educate the market. And I'm thinking in particular of aquaculture right now. So USAID has several programs in aquaculture, and like you said, we have pushed and we have encouraged, and aquaculture farmers have taken on the costs of sustainable certification. And guess what? They're the ones who bear that cost, and if there's no market, and there hasn't been for some of our projects, if there's no market, they bear those costs alone. There's no demonstration effect to other farmers in their communities that taking on that certification was a benefit to them or saw their increase in prices. And that kind of discourages almost sustainable certification or sustainable work, because where's the benefit to them? They've paid, $10,000 for certification, and they have not seen at least $10,000 worth of profit. And I mean, that in and of itself is why USAID, as a donor, thinks it's absolutely critical to work with the companies, and particularly with buyers in this sense. We have an aquaculture program right now within the region, and we're working on, helping farmers sustainably source tilapia and farm eels. And at the same time, we're also then building partnerships with Darden Seafood, with buyers from Whole Foods, which is in the United States, but buyers who and companies who represent buyers that are willing to pay more, and that are willing to pay more for sustainably sourced tilapia, for sustainably sourced eel. But it's critical that we as a donor connect to them, because without that market, we can help all the farmers we want to, but there's nobody buying it. And so it's also then us switching over to the companies saying, help us market it. Help us reach out to your consumers who will pay 50 cents or $2 more, per kilo, per pound, what have you, so that they, at the very beginning of the supply chain, can earn it back.
We've got I'm flooded with questions here, and I'm not going to be able to answer ask any more of them, unfortunately, but I'm going to ask one and then ask each of the panelists to summarize in a short 30 seconds a couple of the points that they think are important to take away. That question, which is polled highest or almost second highest today, is how do we identify vulnerable farming groups that need to be addressed by government policy in rural development? Very quickly an answer to that question, if we can, Riza, and then a couple of points that you think we need to take away from the session.
How do we identify vulnerable farming groups? We have what we call a vulnerability mapping, to identify which among the poorest agricultural producers deserve the most type of support. So, because as you know, across Southeast Asia, you have different gradation of poor farmers. You have poor farmers that own land. You have poor farmers that do not own land. You have poor farmers that are working as farm workers in other farms. So it's important to have that mapping and to design your intervention based on that mapping of vulnerabilities.
Okay, well, let's go to a takeaway. A couple of takeaways, Prakash, please.
So I think the key takeaway for me is that we are really so land is a very critical resource, and we have a large rural population in ASEAN. But on the other side, there is a huge international market as well, which values sustainability, which values food safe products. I think companies like us, and with the help of donor agencies as well as NGOs, we can make the transformation. We can connect the rural areas to the consumer, what we call as farm to fork. I think we can make the connection. It's not an easy task, but then nothing in life is easy. I think life is an ongoing challenge, but I'm not daunted by it. I think we are on the cusp of great possibilities. I see those possibilities in products such as coffee, where there's such a huge demand for gourmet coffee. Actually, if you ask a coffee roaster, he would say there is not enough material. Can you educate the farmer more? So we have huge opportunities, and if we act together, I think the next decade or so we can bring in a huge transformation. Thank you.
Marianne, do you see that?
Yeah, I think last points is, that's why events like these, and that's why we go to events like these, is to make these connections. Whether we represent a smallholder farmer or an NGO or a company or a donor, being able to kind of look at what you bring as an organization and say, okay, what programs is USAID doing? What programs are DFID doing? What is Oxfam doing to support this particular region, this area of Vietnam, et cetera? And then be open to, it might take time, but be open to starting those partnership discussions between the sectors. I mean, that's where we've found a lot of the connectivity that makes very scientific, very transformative, very innovative projects, is working with those partners that we may not have reached out to 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but we're doing it now.
Well, Tony is standing up. I just want you to thank the panel, please. Marianne, Prakash, and Riza. Thank you very much.